I'm busy, Dad. Those words didn't just reach my ears, they pierced through my chest and settled somewhere deep where silence begins. I stood frozen in the hospital corridor, my fingers still wrapped tightly around my phone as if holding it long enough would somehow undo what I had just heard. The call had ended, but the echo of her voice lingered, cold and distant, nothing like the warmth I had known all my life. Just hours ago, everything had been normal. Your mother was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared tea, her movements slow but steady, the same familiar rhythm I had watched for decades. Then suddenly, the cup slipped from her hand. I remember the sound of it shattering on the floor, sharp and unnatural, followed by the sight of her gripping her chest, her face turning pale as fear replaced the gentle calm she always carried. I rushed to her, calling her name again and again, my voice trembling as I tried to hold her up, but she was slipping, her strength fading in my arms like sand through fingers. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and prayers. I don't even remember how we reached the hospital, only the urgency, the chaos, the desperate hope that this was just another moment that would pass. But it didn't pass. Now she lay behind a glass wall in the ICU, surrounded by machines that breathed and beeped for her, each sound a reminder of how fragile life truly is. I had never felt so helpless. I had always been the one who fixed things, who protected my family, who stood strong no matter what life threw at us. But this was beyond me. And so I did the only thing I could think of, I called our daughter. Ariba. The same little girl who once refused to sleep without holding her mother's hand, who used to run into my arms every evening as if I had been gone for years instead of hours. My hands were shaking when I dialed her number, my heart clinging to the belief that she would come, that she would understand, that she would drop everything the moment she heard the words ICU and critical. When she answered, I felt a flicker of relief, a small light in the darkness. Beta, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, your mother is very unwell. She's in the ICU. I need you here. There was a pause, but it wasn't the kind filled with concern or fear. It was brief, almost mechanical, like she was already thinking of something else. And then she said it. I'm busy, Dad. I have meetings. I'll try later. Try later. As if time was something we could negotiate with. As if life waited politely for convenience. I didn't know what to say. My mouth opened, but no words came out. I wanted to tell her that her mother might not survive the night, that this wasn't just another hospital visit, that this could be the last chance to see her, to hold her hand, to say things that might never be said again. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the realization that if she didn't already understand, my words wouldn't change anything. Or maybe it was the fear of hearing something even more painful. So I stayed silent. The call ended, and just like that, I was alone. Completely, painfully alone. I slowly lowered myself onto the cold plastic chair outside the ICU, my body heavy with exhaustion, my mind racing with memories I couldn't control. I remembered the day Ariba was born, how your mother held her for the first time, tears streaming down her face as she whispered promises of love and protection. I remembered the sleepless nights when she would wake up crying, and we would take turns carrying her, walking around the room until she fell asleep again. I remembered her first day at school, how she clung to your mother's dupatta, refusing to let go, her tiny fingers gripping tightly as if the world outside was too big, too unknown. And now that same child couldn't find the time to come see her mother when she needed her the most. The contrast was unbearable. I looked through the glass window into the ICU. Your mother lay still, her chest rising and falling slowly with the help of machines, her face pale but calm in a way that frightened me. She had always been so full of life, her laughter filling every corner of our home, her presence a constant source of comfort. Seeing her like this felt unreal, like I was trapped in someone else's nightmare. A nurse passed by and gave me a sympathetic look, but I could barely acknowledge it. What could anyone say in a moment like this? There are no words that can fix a broken heart or bring back time that has already slipped away. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, my hands covering my face as I tried to steady my breathing. I whispered to myself, she'll come, she has to come. But even as I said it, the words felt empty. Because deep down, I knew something had changed. Something important, something irreversible. It wasn't just about her not coming. It was about what that choice represented. The distance, the priorities, the way life had reshaped her into someone I could no longer recognize. And maybe, just maybe, it was also about us. About the way we had raised her, the things we had given her, and the things we had failed to teach. The thought lingered in my mind, heavy and uncomfortable. Had we given her everything except the understanding of what truly matters? Had we made her world so easy, so comfortable, that she never learned the value of presence, of love, of being there when it counts? I didn't have the answers. All I had was this moment, this long, painful night stretching endlessly before me, filled with the steady beeping of machines and the quiet realization that life doesn't always break with loud noises. Sometimes, it shatters silently, in a few simple words spoken without thought. "I'm busy, Dad." And just like that, everything I believed about family, about love, about the bond we shared, began to crack, piece by piece, leaving me sitting alone in a cold hospital corridor, waiting not just for my wife to survive the night, but for my daughter to remember who she once was. Morning came without warmth, without comfort, without any sense of relief. It arrived quietly like a stranger who had nothing to offer except more waiting, more silence, and more questions that had no answers. I had not slept. Even for a moment the entire night the same plastic chair had held me captive. My back ached, my eyes burned, and my heart felt heavier than it ever had before. Every passing second felt louder than the ticking clock on the wall. Every breath felt like a reminder that time was moving forward. Whether I was ready or not, the hospital corridor slowly filled with movement, nurses walking, doctors discussing, patients' footsteps echoing against the cold floor. Yet everything around me felt distant, as if I was separated from the world by an invisible wall. My world had shrunk to just one place, one door, one fragile life lying behind a glass window. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff and weak, and walked toward the ICU window, again, as if seeing her again would somehow change something. Your mother looked the same as she did hours ago, still quiet, her face pale yet strangely peaceful. Machines surrounded her, their steady beeping creating a rhythm that both comforted and terrified me at the same time. I placed my hand gently against the glass, wishing I could reach through it, hold her hand, and tell her everything would be all right, even though I wasn't sure myself. The doctor approached me again, his expression serious but calm, the kind of calm that doctors learn to wear when they have seen too much. He said, "She is stable for now, but the next 24 hours are very critical. Family support is important." I nodded slowly, the word family echoing painfully in my mind. Family support. I almost let out a bitter smile, but I held it back because what was the point? I thanked him quietly and watched him walk away, his words lingering behind like a shadow. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone again, staring at the screen for a long moment before dialing her number once more. Ariba, my daughter, my hope, my last connection to the life we had built together. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, each ring stretching my patience thinner and thinner, but there was no answer. I cut the call and tried again, still nothing. A deep sigh escaped my lips as I leaned back against the wall, closing my eyes for a second, trying to gather the strength I didn't feel. I opened my messages and typed slowly, "Your mother is asking for you." I stared at the words after sending them, knowing very well it wasn't true. She wasn't asking, she couldn't ask, she hadn't opened her eyes since last night, but I needed something, anything that might bring Ariba here. Maybe guilt, maybe concern, maybe love. I didn't know anymore. Time passed slowly, painfully, each minute dragging itself forward as if it too was exhausted. I kept checking my phone again and again, hoping for a reply, hoping for a sign that she cared enough to come, but the screen remained empty, cold, lifeless, just like the silence around me. Hours later, a notification finally appeared. My heart skipped a beat as I opened the message quickly, as if afraid it might disappear. It read, "Dad, I told you I am busy. Please understand. I will visit when things calm down." Understand, the word hit me harder than anything else. Understand what exactly? That her meetings were more important than her mother fighting for her life, that convenience mattered more than presence, that later was more valuable than now. My hands trembled slightly as I read the message again and again, as if reading it differently might change its meaning, but it didn't. It remained the same, distant, detached, unfamiliar. I lowered my phone slowly, my gaze fixed on the floor as a wave of emotions washed over me. Not anger, not even shock, but something deeper, something heavier, disappointment mixed with a quiet realization that maybe the daughter I thought I knew was no longer the same. I leaned back against the wall, letting out a long breath. Memories began to rise again. Uninvited, unstoppable. Do you remember, Ariba, the nights your mother stayed awake just to make sure you were comfortable? The way she would check your temperature again and again when you had a fever, even when she herself Was tired. Do you remember how she sold her jewelry without a second thought just so you could study in the best university? How she smiled and told you it was nothing when in reality it meant everything to you? Remember how we both sacrificed small dreams quietly so you could chase bigger ones? But maybe you don't remember. Maybe success changed you, or maybe we made it too easy for you to forget. I pushed myself away from the wall and walked into the ICU when the nurse allowed me for a short visit. The air inside felt different, colder, heavier, filled with the faint scent of medicine and machines. I walked slowly toward her bed, each step careful, as if I was afraid of breaking something fragile. I stood beside her and gently held her hand. It was warm but weak, a stark contrast to the strength she had always shown. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady as I spoke. She didn't come, I whispered softly. She said she is busy. My words felt small and significant in the presence of so much silence, but I kept talking anyway, as if she could hear me, as if somewhere deep inside she was still listening. I don't think she understands, I added quietly. A tear slipped down my cheek, falling onto her hand. I didn't wipe it away. I didn't have the energy to pretend anymore. The machines continued their steady rhythm, unaffected by human emotions, unaffected by disappointment, regret, or pain. They simply existed, doing their job without question. I stood there for a few moments longer, holding her hand, wishing for a sign, a movement, anything that would tell me she was still fighting, that she was still with me. But there was nothing, just silence and the sound of machines. I gently placed her hand back and stepped away, my heart feeling heavier than before. As I walked out of the ICU, something inside me began to change. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. The desperation that had kept me calling, waiting, hoping began to fade, replaced by a quiet clarity that settled deep within me. I realized something painful yet undeniable. We had given our daughter everything. We had given her comfort, education, opportunities, love without limits, but somewhere along the way we had failed to teach her the value of those things. We had protected her from hardships so well that she never learned what it meant to stand beside someone in there. As I returned to the chair outside the ICU, but this time I didn't pick up my phone. I didn't check for messages. I didn't expect anything. The waiting was still there, but it felt different, quieter, more controlled, as if I had accepted something I hadn't wanted to accept before. The corridor continued its usual rhythm, people passing by, conversations happening, life moving forward. But for me, time had slowed down, not because of the situation alone, but because of the realization that some distances cannot be measured in miles. They are measured in moments and choices and priorities. And today my daughter had chosen something else over us, over her mother, over this moment that might never come again. I closed my eyes for a brief moment and let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of everything settle inside me. And in that silence I understood something clearly. Not everything breaks with noise. Some things fall apart quietly, without warning, without drama, and by the time you notice it, the pieces are already too far apart to put back together. And as I sat there alone once again, I knew that this was not just about a missed visit or a delayed response. This was about something much deeper, something that had been building over time, unnoticed, ignored until now. And perhaps this moment, this painful, heavy moment, was the one that would change everything, not just for her, but for me as well. By evening, something inside me had grown quiet, not empty, not broken in the way it had felt before, but settled, as if the storm that had raged through my chest all night had finally found a place to rest. I was still sitting in the same corridor outside the ICU, yet everything felt different. The noise of footsteps, the distant voices, the soft hum of hospital machines, all of it faded into the background as a strange calm took over me. I was no longer checking my phone every few minutes, no longer staring at the entrance hoping to see a Reba rushing in with worry on her face. That version of me, the one who waited desperately, had slowly disappeared, and in his place stood someone who had begun to understand something painful yet necessary. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath that felt heavier than it should have been. The doctor's words from earlier echoed again in my mind. We may need to prepare for the worst. They had not frightened me the way I thought they would. Instead, they had forced me to face something I had been avoiding, the possibility that life as I knew it might change forever. I opened my eyes and looked toward the ICU door. My wife was still inside, fighting in her own silent way, unaware of the storm that had passed outside, unaware of the distance that had grown between us and our daughter. I stood up slowly, my legs steady this time, not trembling like before, and walked toward the glass window again. I watched her for a long moment, her face calm, her body still, surrounded by machines that had now become the only bridge between her and life. I placed my hand gently against the glass and whispered, "You always believed she would understand one day. You always said she would come back to us no matter how far she went." I paused, my voice soft yet steady. "Maybe that day is still far away, or maybe we were just holding on to a hope that never truly existed." I let my hand fall back to my side and stepped away from the window, a quiet realization settling deep within me. This was not about anger or revenge. It was about truth, the kind of truth that reveals itself only when everything else falls apart. I returned to the chair, but I didn't sit for long. Instead, I reached into my pocket and took out my wallet. Inside it was an old photograph, slightly worn at the edges, the three of us standing close together, smiling, without worry, without distance, without the weight of unspoken words. I looked at it carefully, tracing the outlines of our faces with my eyes. We were happy then, not because we had everything, but because we had each other. I let out a faint smile. We were rich back then, not in money, not in status, but in something far more valuable, something we didn't even realize we had until it started slipping away. I slipped the photograph back into my wallet and stood up again, this time with purpose. There was something I needed to do, something I had been avoiding, not because it was difficult, but because it required me to accept a reality I wasn't ready to face until now. I walked out of the hospital corridor, leaving behind the cold walls and mechanical sounds, and stepped into the fading light of evening. The sky was painted in shades of orange and gray, a quiet reminder that even endings can be beautiful in their own way. The drive home felt longer than usual, not because of traffic, but because of the thoughts that filled my mind, each one heavier than the last. When I finally reached the house, I paused at the door for a moment before stepping inside. The silence greeted me immediately, the kind of silence that feels unfamiliar in a place once filled with laughter and conversation. I walked slowly into the living room. Everything was exactly as we had left it, her shawl draped over the chair, her cup still resting on the table, as if she would return any moment and pick up where she left off. I stood there for a while, letting the weight of it all sink in before moving toward the bedroom. I opened the locker carefully, my hand steady as I reached inside and took out the files, documents, property papers, savings records, everything we had built over years of hard work, sacrifice, and quiet determination, everything that was meant for Reba, everything we believed would secure her future. I carried the files to the dining table, the same table where we had shared countless meals, celebrated small victories, and comforted each other during difficult times. I placed them down gently and pulled out a chair, sitting in the same spot I had sat in for years, but today it felt different, as if I was no longer the same person. I took a pen from the drawer and held it in my hand for a moment, staring at the blank paper in front of me. This was not an easy decision. It was not driven by anger or disappointment alone. It was driven by clarity, the kind that comes when you finally see things as they truly are, without the filter of hope or expectation. I began to write slowly, each word deliberate, each sentence carrying the weight of everything I had felt but never said. This was not a letter of blame. It was not meant to hurt or accuse. It was meant to reveal, to show her what she had failed to see, not through harsh words, but through quiet truth. I wrote about love, about presence, about the value of being there when it matters most. I wrote about sacrifices made without expectation, and about the emptiness that follows when those sacrifices are forgotten. I wrote about her mother, about the strength she had shown throughout her life in the silent ways she had loved without ever asking for anything in return. And then I wrote about my decision, not as a punishment but as a lesson. Everything we had would no longer go to her, not because she didn't deserve it, but because she had not yet learned what it meant to truly value it. Instead, it would be given to those who understood the meaning of care, who stood beside their loved ones in moments of need, who did not measure their presence in convenience or time. I paused for a moment, my pen hovering above the paper as I took a deep breath. This was the hardest part, not the decision itself, but the acceptance of what it meant. I finished the letter slowly, reading it once to ensure it said everything it needed to say, without unnecessary words, without anger, without regret. When I was done, I folded the paper carefully and placed it inside an envelope, sealing it with a quiet finality that echoed in the silence of the room. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment, letting everything settle within me. I didn't feel relief, not exactly, but I felt something close to it, a sense of completion, as if I had finally done something that needed to be done for a long time, even if I didn't realize it until now. I stood up and gathered the documents, placing them back neatly before returning the envelope to my pocket. The house remained silent as I walked toward the door, but this time the silence didn't feel heavy, it felt honest. I stepped into the night air, taking a deep breath. As I looked up at the sky, the stars were beginning to appear, faint but steady, just like the clarity I now felt within me. This was not revenge, not the kind people expect with anger and loud actions. This was something else, something quieter, something deeper, because sometimes the strongest decisions are the ones made in silence, the ones that don't seek to hurt but to reveal the truth. And as I made my way back toward the hospital, I knew that whatever happened next, whether she understood or not, whether she accepted it or not, this moment, this decision had already changed something within me forever. And for the first time since that call, I felt ready to face whatever came next, not with expectation but with acceptance, not with desperation but with quiet strength. The next morning arrived with a strange stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath, and for the first time since everything had begun. I woke without that crushing weight of expectation pressing down on my chest. I sat in the hospital corridor, once again the same place that had witnessed my fear, my waiting, my silent breakdown. But today something had shifted inside me, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a quiet, steady manner that felt almost unfamiliar. I was no longer checking my phone every few minutes, no longer replaying her words in my mind, no longer asking myself why. Instead, I simply sat there watching the soft light of morning filter through the windows, casting pale shadows across the floor. When I heard hurried footsteps approaching from the far end of the corridor, I looked up slowly, not out of hope but out of habit, and then I saw her, Reba, walking quickly toward me, her face tense, her movements restless, her eyes scanning the hallway until they found me, and for a brief moment time seemed to pause. "Dad," she called out, her voice slightly breathless as she reached me. "How is Mom?" I looked at her carefully, taking in the sight of the daughter I had spent the entire night waiting for, the daughter who had chosen later over now, the daughter who was finally here, but not when she was needed the most. She stood in front of me, adjusting her bag, avoiding my eyes for a second, as if unsure of what she would find in mine. She looked different, not physically, but in a way I couldn't fully explain. Maybe it was the distance that had grown between us, or maybe it was the clarity I now carried within me that allowed me to see things without the softness of denial. She came, I thought to myself, but strangely the urgency I once felt was gone. "She's the same," I said calmly, my voice steady without the tremble it had carried before. Reba nodded quickly, as if trying to fill the silence. "I came as soon as I could," she said, her tone carrying a hint of justification, a quiet defense against something she hadn't yet been accused of. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I simply watched her, allowing the silence to stretch between us long enough for her to feel it, long enough for her to understand that something had changed. "You sound different, Dad," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, uncertain. I let out a faint breath. "Maybe I am," I replied, and that was the truth, not something I had planned to say, but something that existed whether I acknowledged it or not. She hesitated, shifting her weight slightly. "Did something happen?" she asked, her eyes finally meeting mine, searching for answers. I reached into my pocket slowly and took out the envelope, the letter that had been written not in anger but in clarity, the letter that carried everything I had come to understand. "This is for you," I said, handing it to her. She looked at it, confused, her fingers wrapping around it as if unsure whether to open it now or later, but something in my expression must have told her that this moment mattered, because she opened it right there in front of me, unfolding the paper with careful hands. As her eyes began to move across the words I had written, I watched her closely, not with judgment, not with expectation, but with a quiet awareness of what was unfolding in front of me. At first her expression remained neutral, focused as she read each line, but slowly it began to change. Her brows tightened, her lips parted slightly, her breathing shifted as the meaning of the words settled, and her eyes widened with disbelief, as if she couldn't fully grasp what she was reading. And then came the silence, the kind that speaks louder than any reaction. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I held her gaze calmly. "You will," I replied softly, because I knew this wasn't something that could be explained in a single moment or understood through a single reading. It was something she would have to sit with, something that would unfold within her over time. The letter wasn't harsh, it didn't accuse or blame, it simply reflected the truth of what had happened, the truth of what had been missed, and the truth of the decision I had made. Everything we had built, everything we had saved would no longer be hers, not out of anger, not as a punishment, but as a consequence of something deeper, something she had yet to fully comprehend. Her hands began to tremble slightly as she held the paper, her eyes moving back over certain lines as if hoping they might change if she read them again. Tears slowly filled her eyes and spilled over, falling onto the paper. She clutched. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said, her voice breaking under the weight of realization. "I didn't realize I needed you yesterday," I said, gently interrupting her words, not to dismiss them, but to place them where they truly belonged. "Not today." The sentence hung between us, heavy and undeniable, and for the first time she didn't try to respond immediately. She didn't defend herself or explain her absence. She simply stood there, absorbing the truth of what had been lost in a moment that could not be brought back. "I know," she whispered after a pause, her voice shaking. "I should have come." I nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of her understanding, because that was all that mattered now, not excuses, not justifications, but the realization itself. Her tears continued to fall as she folded the letter slowly, her movements careful, almost fragile, as if the paper itself carried more weight than she could hold. For the first time since she arrived, she reached out and held my hand tightly, the way she used to when she was a child. Her grip firm yet trembling, as if she was trying to hold on to something slipping away. I looked at her hand wrapped around mine, and for a brief moment I saw it not as it was now, but as it had once been, small, warm, trusting. A memory layered over reality, blending past and present into something bittersweet. I didn't pull my hand away, but I didn't tighten my grip either. I simply let it be what it was, a connection that still existed, but had changed with time. I glanced toward the ICU window where her mother still lay, unaware of the quiet storm unfolding outside. Then I looked back at Ariba. "This isn't punishment," I said softly, my voice calm yet firm. "It's a lesson." She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face as the meaning of those words settled within her, not just as something she heard, but as something she felt deeply. And in that moment I saw it, not the successful, independent woman she had become, not the version of her shaped by ambition and distance, but the little girl we had once known. The one who needed guidance, who needed to understand, who needed to find her way back to something she had lost along the journey. Maybe this was the moment that would change her. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, not a return to what once was, but a step toward something more aware, more present, more real. The corridor remained quiet around us, life continuing as it always does, indifferent to individual moments of realization. But for us, everything had shifted. Something had been broken, but something else had also begun to form, something fragile yet meaningful. And as I stood there beside my daughter, no longer waiting, no longer expecting, I realized that sometimes the deepest changes don't come from loud confrontations or dramatic endings. They come from quiet truths spoken at the right time, truths that linger long after the moment has passed, truths that reshape not just decisions but hearts. And as she stood there holding my hand, crying silently, I knew that whatever happened next, whether she fully understood or not, whether she changed or not, this moment would stay with her. This lesson would follow her, and maybe, just maybe, one day she would look back and realize that the greatest loss wasn't what she didn't receive, but what she almost lost without even noticing. And that realization would be the beginning of everything she needed to become, not just successful but present, not just accomplished but truly human.